Today, building and building. Are we following Vancouver? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one of the latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian and New Zealand flavour. And I'm joined again by Joe Wilkes, our property expert from New Zealand. Hi Joe, how are you going?
I thought I'd talk today about our building explosion, Martin, because we've got a lot happening on the building front, and we've historically, Auckland City Council have tried to model themselves on a little city in Canada called Vancouver, which there's lots of similarities between Auckland and Vancouver. There's water. There's been a high propensity for foreign investment, and like Auckland, where we have got empty houses equating to about 33,000 or 6.7% of the total housing stock. Vancouver also has got quite a lot of empty houses, around 100,000. Both over the last sort of 24 months have had some changes in what they've done to try and calm down the incursion of foreign capital into their marketplaces. In Vancouver, they've introduced an empty homes tax, which has had an impact. In New Zealand, we've done something slightly different, which is the foreign buyer ban, which came into effect on October 23rd last year. Both countries have, I think, more importantly, and these are probably quite relevant, introduced more stringent anti-money laundering regulations. In Vancouver, they came in last year. Our date was the 1st of January this year. Vancouver and Auckland, Canada and New Zealand have been very slow to implement anti-money laundering regulations. I was working in real estate back in the UK, and we started this back in 2014, at the same time as introducing an increased stamp duty for overseas investment. So beyond the natural stamp duty, there was an extra surcharge for foreign investment, 12%, which on top of the other bans was quite penal. Slow to catch on. Auckland, Vancouver went on a merry dash of increasing property values, and both seem to be now having mixed fortunes. Now, the Auckland City Council over the last few years, a lot of their rhetoric, a lot of their publications have been about trying to emulate Vancouver. Now, they're never going to position themselves right on the outskirts of the world's biggest marketplace, but they have got some ideas of putting in infrastructure, light rail, all these various bits and pieces. We've now got Auckland Cities Council there, I think, kicking around 9 billion. So they're not scared of borrowing money, but there are projects now that are being panned because they're not able to borrow as much as they'd like to borrow. So when you're trying to borrow money, or you can't borrow it anymore, what do? You try and get it off your people. So we've seen fuel surcharge, so an increase in the tax on petrol around Auckland to pay for the road infrastructure. We've also seen, I think, an encouragement by the council for the fees that they attach to building applications. And building applications have gone gangbusters. The Auckland dwellings consented for May of this year. So 2019, over 1,600 consents issued. So these aren't houses that have been built, but over the last few years, there's normally a lag from when a consent's issued to when it's built, and 97% of consents end up being built within 2 or 3 years. So we've got all these consents that have happened. 2018 was a record year. And it's really interesting that we're nationally, the consents across the country, I think, were 36,000 over the course of last year. We're back at building consents being issued that are as high as they were in the early 1970s. Now, I like to think about, what causes big consents in the 1970s and why have we got big consents now? Well, the 1970s massive building programs were the result of a couple of things, I believe. And one is the start of the need for housing of the baby boom generation. Now, in New Zealand, baby boomers, the birth year starts in 1946 and you go through to 1964 for I guess what the classification is. But in New Zealand, we have a big spike where the numbers of people that were born in 1955, 56, all the way up to 1962 just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, why would you need a housing boom in the 1970s? It is to satisfy housing, the sweethearts who met at school and got married in their early 20s and needed a house to live in 1973, 74, 75, 76, so 20 years after their birth. That's why there's such a big building program back then. Now, today we've got a different type of building boom, and building is the thing that really propped up the first quarter's GDP numbers in New Zealand. So the March quarter, we didn't get the figures until the end of June. Growth in the construction sector grew at 0.8%, and it really did, with annual growth therefore 2.4%, but it really did sort of help to compensate for the drop-off that we've seen in the services sector. Now, this building boom, which I've driven around in our out and about in sunny New Zealand Post and the Auckland Post, this building boom has gone haywire, and we've now got construction happening at a time where not only are we building loads for the current generation, well, yes, we've still got reasonably high immigration, it's come off a little bit, but that's still going. But what we've also got to factor in is that there is this baby boom generation who are now the 55-year 64, retirement beckons next year. They're often still in the family home that they bought back in the 70s. They bought their investment properties and everything else, but the family home is the one that they're thinking about selling and downsizing from. So we could see over the next 2 or 3 years all of this building of new stuff competing with all the building of the baby boomer stuff, and a lot of pressure on the middle and upper ends of the market, which we know is already where the volumes of transactions are falling off. Now, I thought I'd have a little look, and the Auckland City Council Chief Economist provided some data on a LinkedIn feed that I spotted the other day, and this is the annual consents by local board to May 2019, and it breaks up the various suburbs, and you can see where the apartments have been consented. So we've got a lot of apartments going up in the central parts of Auckland. You can see the makeup of townhouses and flats and multi-unit developments. Retirement villages, there's actually an awful lot of construction in this sector, and I've driven around some of these, a couple that we did in the post that we did on Palmerston North and its surrounds, which are being built, but they're unoccupied, and there's quite a lot of this happening. The valuations of those businesses have been going up, but the occupancy rates, that's the one that we're going to question moving forward. But what's also really noticeable is just how many single houses are being developed, and I think a lot of these are being developed by the older generation as their speculative move to try and boost their retirement savings. And when you look at the extent of the house development, we're not going to have a shortage when you consider that the likelihood is, I think 10,500 units were built in Auckland over the last 12 months. This is going to escalate for the next 2 or 3 years, and we may well see only 17,000 sales in Auckland over the course of the 12 months of 2019. So that leaves 6,000 or 7,000 sales to be distributed among all the other 500,000 houses that have already been built and constructed, because developers, when they have finished, they've got two options: they sell it or they rent it. If they rent it, dead money, probably can't finance the next project, so often they do have to sell it. So I wanted to bring this up because, going back to the Vancouver example, they did exactly the same thing. So they built for all this foreign money that's hitting the market, developers going gangbusters, massive profits being made, and in May, the level of new sales was 90% down on May of last year. So they sold just 115, 116 units in May. So exactly the same thing that's happening there. I think, we're not isolated. We're not immune to this. We've had similar influencing factors. I think people need to think about, okay, right, what's going to happen here? And again, going back to as a business, if you're selling real estate, get into renting property as well. If you're not doing it, make sure you've got a property management division as part of your business. If you are developing into this, hurry up.
Well, Jeff, one interesting thing. We have more than 1 million down traders in Australia. So they're exactly the people you're talking about. So they've got this large property with a reasonable amount of equity, but they're now getting to the point where they're moving into retirement. And now they're trying to work out whether they should try and sell. And what I've noticed recently in my survey is that there are two other trends now coming through. The first trend is subdivide your existing place. In other words, build something else on it to try and actually generate some capital that way.
Borrow a bit of money off the family home.
Yeah, exactly. The other is to add a granny flat or add a, not a complete new, but something else that you can let out or rent or other.
Yeah.
So in both cases, what they're doing is creating another unit of occupation, right?
Yeah, and I want to say that this is really risky, and the New Zealand media aren't talking about this, and the council, they won't talk about this because they need those fees. They need the fees for installing the drainage, and it's exorbitant. You could be looking at, before you've even done anything, you could look at 100 grand of cost worth of work to the council, and all of it there's a massive margin on. So if you're considering it, I'm not saying don't go and get the permission, but before you go ahead and do it, just be careful, because you're going to be competing with the biggest boom in new construction that we have seen in New Zealand since the 1970s. Very, very, very interesting times.
Yeah, and of course we know that prices in Vancouver are also now looking quite wobbly as well, and that's all part of that same set of issues, right? Partly the tightening of the availability of credit, partly the change to the AML laws, and the fact that the demand is just not there.
Yeah, well, the bubble almost mirrors, and if you look back at Vancouver average prices and you go from Auckland, it started 2012-13 and it gathered pace into 2016, then it hit the straps. Now, because we've carried on and we haven't had a foreign buyer ban for another 2 years really, or until beginning, end of 2017, ours has flatlined, because while the locals haven't been able to really increase the amount of credit that they've been able to take on, and credit growth in New Zealand has fallen off 9% annual credit to 6.3% over the last 12-month period. That's still enormous. We're over $265 billion worth of household debt now, and that was, I think, talking to you not very many months ago, our household debt was only 252 billion. So I think we've added 15 billion worth of household debt in 12 months. So that is not enough to keep things going in the absence of this foreign liquidity, and it's becoming obvious because things aren't selling. The sales levels for Auckland are right back to where they were in 2012. They're a third down on the peak levels that we saw in 2015-16. And this year, I can't see anything that's going to slow that down. So there's going to be all this new stock, loads and loads and loads of it, loads of new stuff, which will need to be sold. And the buyers need to be a little bit patient, I think.
Well, I'll just tell you that in Australia, of course, we've decided that what we need to do is to cut interest rates really hard, reduce the lending standards, and encourage yet more people to come into the market, increase the debt, because there's no other solution. I fear that you might be going the same way over there too.
Well, if you've ever been to Ireland, Martin, very similar things happened over there, I tell you. It's just my cousin Patrick, he was over there, he was building willy-nilly, he was enjoying it, he was out with his mates in the sunshine every day, and then all of a sudden the bank stopped lending the money. And, he moved to Australia.
Yeah. Yes, I wonder why that might be. Joe, that's a very important set of insights again, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Martin.
See you. Take care.
Take care, mate. All the best. Bye.